I've covered some disturbing cases before, but this one is something else. A crime that defies logic, a murder with no memory, no motive, and no clear answers. It happened in the dead of night, a brutal killing. A man waking up to find his wife stabbed multiple times. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and yet the only person in the room was him. A murder like this should have been simple to solve, but what if the killer had no idea he had done it? No recollection of the attack, no violent history, no reason to kill. That's what Brian Thomas claimed, that he loved his wife, that he would never harm her, that he was asleep completely unaware of the horror unfolding in that bedroom. It's the kind of case that makes you question everything you know about human nature. Can a person truly kill without knowing it? Can the mind betray the body in such a violent, horrifying way? Or was this the perfect crime? Because the evidence pointed to one chilling fact. Whether he knew it or not, Brian Thomas was the only possible suspect. His defense: he was asleep when he did it. The story begins in the summer of 2009. Brian Thomas and his wife, Brooke Preston, had been together for years. By all accounts, they were happy. They had built a life together, one filled with plans, routines, and love. There was no history of violence, no known marital problems, no hidden secrets, at least none that anyone had discovered. To the outside world, Brian and Brooke were just another couple enjoying their time together, looking forward to the years ahead. But then came the trip. A simple vacation, a break from their normal routine. They had checked into a quiet holiday home, a peaceful remote location, the perfect place to unwind. The air was crisp, the night was still. It was supposed to be a time of rest, a time to recharge. Instead, it became a crime scene. By morning, Brooke Preston would be dead, and Brian Thomas would be left holding the knife. He would later claim he had no memory of what happened, no explanation for why his wife, his partner, his best friend was lying in a pool of blood. But that night, something inside his mind had betrayed him. Or at least, that's what he wanted people to believe. Brian Thomas would later tell police that the night had started just like any other. Nothing had felt off. Nothing had seemed strange. He and Brooke had gone to bed as usual, side by side, drifting into sleep in the quiet safety of their holiday home. But at some point during the night, something changed. He woke up with a start. His chest was heaving. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Something was wrong. At first, he couldn't tell why. The room was dark, silent, except for his own panicked breathing. And then, as his eyes adjusted, he turned toward Brooke. She wasn't moving. He called her name. No response. He reached for her, shaking her shoulder, and that's when he saw it. The bed, the sheets, his hands, everything was covered in blood. He didn't remember doing anything. He swore he didn't. But when he looked down, the knife was in his hand. His mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. There was no way he had done this. His first thought: someone had broken in. That had to be it. An intruder. Someone had attacked Brooke while they were sleeping. And somehow, Brian had fought back. But as he stumbled out of the bedroom, heart racing, searching for any sign of forced entry, a sickening realization settled over him. The doors were still locked. The windows were shut. Nothing was disturbed. There was no intruder, no one else in the house. The only person who could have done this was him. Brian Thomas called 911 in a state of absolute hysteria. His words tumbled out, barely coherent, his voice raw with panic. "I think I've killed my wife, but I don't remember doing it. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, asking for details, but how do you comfort someone who's just realized they might be a murderer? Brian kept repeating the same words over and over. He didn't understand. He didn't know what had happened. One moment he was asleep. The next he was standing in a nightmare. When police arrived, they found him in complete shock. His hands were trembling, covered in blood. His clothes were stained with it. The knife, slick and red, had been discarded on the floor beside him. He looked down at it as if he had never seen it before in his life. There was no struggle, no forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone else had been inside the house, and on the bed, Brooke Preston lay still. She had been stabbed repeatedly. The injuries were deep, fatal. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Brian Thomas collapsed to his knees. He kept asking the same question over and over. How could I have done this? From the outside, this looked like an open and shut case. A man kills his wife. No sign of anyone else in the house. No defensive wounds. No struggle. It had to be him. But there was one massive problem. Brian insisted that he had no memory of stabbing Brooke. He kept saying he loved her, that they had been happy. They had been planning their future together, making arrangements for their next big trip. There had been no fights, no tension, no reason for him to suddenly snap. He wasn't denying that he had done it, but he was denying knowing that he had done it. And then he said something even stranger. I think I was dreaming. Brian Thomas sat across from the detectives, his hands still shaking, his face pale. He kept running a hand through his hair, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to explain what had happened. I was dreaming, he said. In the dream, there had been an intruder, a shadowy figure lurking in the room, a presence that didn't belong. He could feel the danger, the weight of it pressing down on him. And then, in his mind, the figure moved. It lunged at him. He had to defend himself. He had to protect Brooke. Brian described fighting back, the struggle, the desperation. He lashed out over and over again until the attacker stopped moving. And then he woke up. But there was no intruder, no dark figure, no fight for survival. The only person in the room with him had been his wife, and she was covered in blood. His dream, if that's what it was, had become a waking nightmare. Forensic experts began piecing together the gruesome reality of what had happened in that room. Brooke had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds were deep, violent, frenzied. There was nothing methodical about them, no signs of a calculated attack, no indication that this had been premeditated. But there was something else, something that didn't sit right. Brooke had no defensive wounds, no cuts on her hands, no bruises from struggling, nothing that suggested she had fought back. It was almost like she never saw it coming, which meant one of two things. Either she had been asleep when it happened, or she had trusted the person attacking her so much that she never believed, even in her final moments, that she was in danger. The case took a bizarre turn when Brian's legal team introduced a defense that sounded like something out of a horror movie. They claimed he had killed his wife in his sleep. The idea was so outlandish, so unbelievable, that at first it seemed like a desperate excuse, a last-ditch attempt to avoid responsibility. But then, sleep disorder experts were brought in, scientists, neurologists, people who had studied the human brain for decades, and what they revealed was terrifying. There exists a rare but well-documented condition called REM sleep behavior disorder, a disorder where the brain fails to do what it's supposed to during sleep. Normally, when we dream, our bodies are temporarily paralyzed to keep us from acting out whatever is happening in our minds. But in cases of REM sleep behavior disorder, that paralysis doesn't happen. The barrier between the dream world and reality breaks down, and sometimes those dreams turn violent. In most cases, REM sleep behavior disorder is harmless. People might talk in their sleep, flail their arms, or sit up suddenly without realizing it. Some even sleepwalk without ever remembering a thing the next morning. But in rare, extreme cases, the consequences are far more chilling. People have gotten out of bed, moved around, even driven cars completely unconscious, completely unaware of what they were doing. And in the most disturbing cases, they have attacked loved ones in the middle of the night. Some have strangled their spouses. Others have thrown punches, kicked, or even used weapons, all while still trapped inside their dreams. The defense argued that this is exactly what happened to Brian Thomas, that in his dream he was protecting Brooke from an intruder, fighting off a phantom threat, and in reality, he was stabbing the woman he loved to death. The question was, could this really be true? Had Brian Thomas unknowingly become a killer in his sleep, or was this an elaborate cover story for something far more sinister? The prosecution wasn't convinced. From their perspective, this was a textbook murder case. A husband kills his wife in the middle of the night, then scrambles to find an excuse. And what better excuse than claiming he was asleep when he did it? They argued that Brian Thomas was faking his sleep disorder, that his dream was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie designed to explain away a violent crime. They pointed to something crucial: his 911 call. If he had been in such a deep, unconscious sleep while committing the murder, how did he suddenly snap back into full awareness the moment it was over? How did he have the presence of mind to dial 911, to realize what had happened, and to express genuine horror at the scene around him? If he had been in a fugue state, wouldn't it have taken him longer to process the situation? And there was another issue. Brian had no history of violent sleep episodes. Sleepwalking cases like this were incredibly rare, and when they did happen, they were usually tied to a long history of sleep disturbances, years of documented episodes, witnesses who had seen the person act out their dreams before. But Brian, nothing. No reports of sleepwalking, no prior incidents, no indication that he had ever been violent in his sleep before that night. The prosecution believed that his defense was a convenient way to escape punishment, that he knew exactly what he was doing. And then came the polygraph test. Brian agreed to take a polygraph test, something no defense attorney would normally advise if they had any doubt about their client's truthfulness. The test was designed to measure deception, heart rate, breathing patterns, stress responses, every involuntary reaction a person's body makes when they lie. And the results: he passed. No deception detected, no stress indicators, no physiological signs that he was lying. If he had been making this up, if he had knowingly murdered Brooke and was now playing the part of the devastated husband, his body should have reacted differently. There should have been spikes in his vitals, increased anxiety levels. But there weren't. To the experts administering the test, he wasn't just telling the truth, he believed he was telling the truth. And that raised a terrifying question. What if he really had been asleep when he killed her? The case dragged on for weeks, with the courtroom turning into a battleground between science and skepticism. On one side, the prosecution insisted that Brian Thomas was a murderer, a man who had brutally killed his wife and was now hiding behind a medical excuse. On the other, sleep disorder specialists testified that what happened was not only possible, but had happened before. They brought in past cases that sounded just as surreal. One man had gotten out of bed, driven 20 miles, and murdered someone all while unconscious. Another had strangled his wife in his sleep, only to wake up in complete horror at what he had done. In both cases, the men had no memory of their actions, just like Brian. The jury listened to testimony after testimony, stories that blurred the line between medical science and the terrifying unknown. How many people were capable of this? How many others had done the unthinkable without ever realizing it? If these cases were real, was it so impossible to believe that Brian Thomas was telling the truth? It defied logic. It was almost impossible to believe. But the more the evidence was examined, the more the pieces lined up. No motive, no history of violence, a seemingly happy marriage. And then one final terrifying fact came to light. Brian had taken sleeping pills that night. Medication designed to help with sleep. Medication that, in rare cases, had been linked to sleepwalking, memory blackouts, and even episodes of extreme behavior. Was this the missing piece? Had the combination of Brian's existing sleep disorder and the sedatives in his system triggered the perfect storm, a moment where his mind lost control of his body? Or was this just another convenient excuse, a way to explain away something far more sinister? The courtroom was electric with tension. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The jury had been given a choice, one that carried unimaginable weight. Was Brian Thomas a cold-blooded killer, fully aware of what he had done, using sleep as a convenient excuse? Or was he a man trapped in his own subconscious, a victim of his own mind, forced to live with the horror of what his body had done? The prosecution had fought hard. They painted Brian as a husband who had snapped, who had carried out a brutal, frenzied attack and then scrambled for a way out. But the defense had brought forward science, undeniable cases of others who had done the impossible, killed without ever waking up. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent. Not a single breath, not a single movement. Then the decision was read aloud. Not guilty. Gasps rippled through the room, some in shock, some in outrage. Brian Thomas was free. Brian Thomas stood there trembling as the words sank in. He was not guilty. But not guilty didn't mean innocent. The court had ruled that he had indeed killed his wife. There was no denying that. But he had not been awake when he did it, and because of that, he could not be held criminally responsible. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. But for Brooke Preston's family, justice felt unfinished. They had lost their daughter, their sister, their loved one. She was gone, stolen from them in the most brutal way imaginable. And the man who had killed her, he was free to live his life, free to wake up every morning, free to close his eyes at night. But the question that haunted everyone was the same. If Brian Thomas had no control over what he had done, how could they be sure it would never happen again? Years later, experts still debate the case. Some believe Brian Thomas was telling the truth, that he was a tragic victim of a rare and terrifying sleep disorder, that he had no control over his actions, that when he woke up to find his wife dead, he was just as horrified as anyone else would be. Others, they aren't so sure. To them, the case was a legal loophole, an open door for anyone to commit the perfect crime. They argued that Brian knew exactly what he had done, that the sleepwalking defense was just a carefully planned excuse, one that left the court with no choice but to let him go. And the most unsettling part, there was no way to prove it either way. Science could explain the disorder. Experts could testify about its effects, but no one could say with absolute certainty what Brian had been thinking, or if he had truly been unconscious when he killed his wife. And that meant the world had to accept the possibility that a murderer had walked free. But Brian Thomas's case wasn't unique. There are cases like this all over the world, people who claim they were unconscious when they killed. Husbands who strangle their wives in their sleep. Parents who wake up to find they've harmed their own children. People who, in the dead of night, turn into someone or something else entirely. And every time, the same question lingers. How do you prove it? How do you know if someone was truly asleep or just pretending? A brain scan won't reveal a guilty conscience. A polygraph can't detect the difference between a dream and reality. So when a person stands in front of a judge and says, "I wasn't awake," how can we ever be sure they're telling the truth? The scariest part. Brian Thomas's case wasn't an isolated incident. Sleepwalking murders still happen. They've happened before and they will happen again. There are dozens of documented cases of people committing violent, even deadly, acts while in a state of unconsciousness, and in some of the most disturbing cases, the killers don't even remember their own trials. There have been men and women who have sat in courtrooms completely detached from the horror of what they had done because in their minds it had never happened. They had gone to sleep one night believing everything was normal, and by the time they were fully awake, their lives had already changed forever. So, how do we deal with something like this? Do we hold them accountable? Do we accept that sometimes the brain can betray us in ways we can't control? Or do we acknowledge something far darker, that anyone could commit an unthinkable act in their sleep and never even know it? So, what really happened that night? Did Brian Thomas murder his wife in cold blood, knowing exactly what he was doing? Or was he trapped inside a nightmare, one so real, so intense, that his mind convinced him he was fighting for his life? And the most terrifying question of all, if someone can commit murder in their sleep, how do we ever know we're truly safe?